This is a session on measurement that I asked to moderate. I've never done a moderation before. I've always been on a panel, so this is a fun twist and turn for me. So when we decided to do this, we thought it'd be good to have multiple perspectives. And so we have a brand, we have an agency, and a consultancy, if you will. And I think we should first start just doing quick introductions. So I'll start with Ross, then Joseph, and Anna, then I'll go into the questions. Ross?
Ross Miller. I was at Estee Lauder Companies for about 10 years. I got a chance to collaborate with Doug closely during most of that time. I led analytics within the online division and managed CRM. And then more recently, I've led D2C and retailer.com for CPG brands like Nash Patka, Jane Iredale, and Function.
All right, I'll go next. You guys hear me okay? Joe Pagano from TransUnion. So I sit in marketing solutions business at TU. TransUnion might not be top of mind for marketing, and that's okay. We're working on that. It's through a series of acquisitions. I came from an acquisition of a company called Newstar about 2.5 years ago, and we've integrated all of those solutions into the TransUnion True Audience platform. So I'm responsible for our global professional services team. So working with clients for measurement and optimization, ID resolution, audience activation, and insights. Sit in the New York office, happy to be here on this panel with everybody.
Hello everyone, Anna Yarkosky from EY. I've been in consulting for over 8 years at multiple different consulting firms, don't tell anyone. But with EY, really in our marketing practice, not in marketing for EY, but we actually support our other clients and customers on everything from how do you set up a strategy to meet and obtain your customers and clients, all the way through how do you effectively track and measure that your strategy is working. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So let's start with some background information. Commerce Next, which is another community group, publishes an annual benchmark report. And in the last report, they talked about what kind of measurement techniques are used by marketers. And they said that 86% of marketers use last touch ROAS, 59% use incrementality testing, another 59% use customer lifetime value, 39% use attribution models, and 27% use marketing mix models. So again, 86% last touch ROAS, it seems like everyone does use that. I would argue that most corporations or brands are using a combination. At Estee Lauder Companies, we used last touch ROAS because why not? But we also really leveraged MMM, and that's the capability that I built at the company. And I would argue that it's really a triangulation of approaches which really gets marketers the answers that they need. So let's start there. What's your POV on different measurement approaches? We'll start with Anna, then we'll go to Joseph, and then to Ross.
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying that they're all very important, and I'm going to use a favorite consulting word. It depends on when you use them. So, sometimes when they all are meant to help you with like what your business objectives and goals are. So there's certain constraints around each of those different measurements that you'll need to take into consideration. For example, there's a timing constraint around certain measurements. So MMM, typically you measure quarterly or annually, depending on when the data is refreshed. Versus ROAS, you can track and measure you can track and measure and optimize more frequently. There's also, cost considerations. So an MMM model is typically more expensive. It can be time-consuming to ingest and get the right data. And versus ROAS is typically something that can be a little bit cheaper and more cost-effective. There's also a consideration around: are you looking to track performance long-term? Are you looking to track more of a short-term performance? It's another consideration and constraint around what you track when. And then something that people sometimes forget is who are you trying to tell the story to? So a finance person might not think ROAS is a super important metric to track versus ROI. So it's always important, and we've seen this at a lot of clients, to make sure you have the right story for the right audience.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, right? All of that is fair, it's all true. You know, at TransUnion, we measure things a lot of different ways. We support what I call multimodal triangulation, I think of 3, and there's more than 3 ways to measure. It's no different than your weather forecaster, right? They're looking at things like barometric pressure, temperature, which way the winds are blowing. You can't make an informed decision on a limited data set, and there's no, despite what we try, right, there's no mother of all models, right? You have to use the appropriate measurement technique to extract the signal from real-world noisy data. And you do have to tailor it to the question, to the need, and to the audience, within that budget, within that timing constraint. All of those things are real-world realities we live in. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't sort of read people's minds, so we have to use that for triangulation methodology. I think what's important when you're trying to mix and match methodologies together is it becomes really easy to cherry pick insights from each one that support a narrative that you already kind of thought was the narrative that you wanted. And you need to measure things appropriately. So the right tool for the right job, not trying to shoehorn bad measurement into a conversation because there might be a metric that fits your storyline. The other piece of that is you don't need everything to necessarily point the same direction, right? So we have a lot of meta-analyses or ensemble models, which are basically just weight averages. You kind of lose all of the real insights that you get from these different measurement modalities, the different techniques, the different data, and you just kind of blurry everything up, right? You muddy it into an average. We believe that you can harmonize those into a true North Star while still maintaining the integrity of the individual analyses. And there's some interesting analytic techniques. This is not a methodology workshop, but happy to talk about those offline of how you can do that. So preserving all of the richness that you get from, say, a user level analysis or an RCT or an MMM without sort of handicapping everything to the lowest common denominator and saying, this is kind of the weighted average of what it all looks like, or worse, picking the thing that shoots the narrative at that given point in time. It's the easiest way to damage your credibility as a marketer is to constantly change your story, change where the answers are coming from, and then you might as well just save the money and time in analytics and just shoot from the hip like marketers have done, unfortunately, for the last time immemorial.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think media mix modeling really showcases incrementality. I think with last touch attribution, you can make sure that you're doing it well. It is really basic, but just make sure you're capturing all the data, that it's named and tagged accurately, that you have the right taxonomy. I think for media mix modeling, one thing that I've seen is there's been a shift, at least in the digital ecosystem, from them being large projects that are 6 months in arrears to having productized models that update weekly, and we set that out at Function of Beauty. So, depending on how complex your media is, you could look into, doing something with more regularity. And I think also baking in some incrementality testing, like really making decisions that you're comfortable with, and doing geo holdouts and testing things that you're not.
So obviously data is the prerequisite to most of the triangulation of approaches that we've been talking about. And I would argue there's not a really clear roadmap to do that. But I think, Ross, you've told me you've had success at bringing together different data sources into a centralized data lake. Do you want to start and talk about what you've done there?
Yeah, coming out of Estee Lauder companies, I went to a pretty small brand called Naturopathica, and I had a conversation with the COO, and I was like, hey, I think there's some more, modern ability to do reporting. It could be an opportunity. We were like a 30-person company. Like, maybe it's not right for us right now. And he's like, that sounds great. Like, go do that. And I started looking into it, and I was able to aggregate all the digital platforms, so Google, Meta, we were doing Amazon Media at the time, and I've since been able to sort of iterate on this in my last couple of roles and take it to the next level. But I think something that's really helped me make decisions about the business and really collaborate with our agency is getting all the data from the platforms that we're running and centralizing it with other internal KPIs. So in e-commerce land, it's traffic, traffic by channel, sales by product, margin, performance to forecast, and then looking at your overall media numbers by platform, by type of campaign, Google brand search versus non-brand versus PMax, and then getting that into what I would call a data lake, so something like BigQuery, AWS Redshift, Databricks, Snowflake are some of the main players that I see, and then putting a reporting application on top of that. And I would say, I know there's a lot of huge brands with lots of data and maybe some bigger IT teams, but I think it's easier than you think. And if you haven't done it, it's definitely worth exploring. It's really been a game changer for me.
No, in our prep, both Joseph and Anna, you had some really good points about data taxonomy. So let's go to Joseph and then Anna.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my standard data request is always all rows, all columns. And a lot of that has to do with, that really granular, that atomic level data. It gives you the flexibility to do a lot of things, but the taxonomy on top of that is key. And the flexibility of the taxonomy, because you may have a media taxonomy that works for a channel or a brand or a product. You may have a different taxonomy that works for a different set of stakeholders. And the ability to pivot that data for different use cases, for different analytical needs is important. And that's where log level data is something that we think is a superpower. It's not easy to get, it's not easy to manage, it's huge. It's often also privileged, right? In a world of walled gardens, they don't want to let that log data out. One of the things that we think is important is access, right? When we think about building an analysis for a client, you can have great math, you can have great software, great tech, but if you have no data, you have nothing. So since data is the thing that makes all of these fancy models work, we think it's the underpinning of the entire ecosystem. But without good access, and that's not just access from the platforms, but to your point, access to your internal stakeholders, your data science teams, your BI teams, right? There's a lot of good that can be done with just good old-fashioned eyeball analysis. Doesn't need to be machine learning or AI. Having it all in one place, knowing what's missing, right? And that's another piece I think that often is forgotten with last touch attribution models or even other models that are out there, is that missing data bias. There's always something missing, some latent variable that you either can't capture, don't capture, or haven't considered, that you need to make sure you're constantly on the lookout for new and interesting. What are the proxies? What are the emerging channels? And the last piece that I'll add, besides taxonomy and log level data, is understanding what the data really represents. An impression is not an impression. A session is not a session. A click is not a click, right? These are not universal definitions, depending on where they come from. And in a world of alt currencies for video and TV and streaming and audio, right, a TRP is not always a TRP. The definitions are different. What those mean when you get into a model and situation is also very different. How you would action on them, right? We often have a debate, do optimize to email sends or email opens? I won't answer the question here because it's a debate, but there's good reasons why you would use one or the other. And oftentimes that's just, hey, throw it into the model, get data, shove it into the algo, and out comes an answer on the other side without really considering what the data meant, how it was captured, and then how would you actually translate that into something not actionable. Actionable is a word that I think is often overused, right? Actionable. I could walk to California. Impactful, right? What's actually going to drive a difference in the business? That's what I try to focus on. So the data is important, but there's a lot of nuance under there. It's not just good enough to have it, you have to understand it.
Couldn't agree more. I think one of the other interesting components is you might not own the data. It might be another team that owns the data. It might be a sales data, it might be finance, it might be merchandising or product that you need to collect from other areas of business. It might be your media agency. So getting that data all in one place and in a consistent format is so important to the taxonomy point. But not just in a consistent format, but documented in the same way. So, for example, I can't tell you how many times I've seen YouTube written out 10 different ways, and you can't track then how much you're spending with that partner if it's in 10 different formats. So, couldn't agree more that taxonomy, getting it all into one place is very, very important and the foundation.
Great. Let's talk now about new channels, new marketing factors. So things like podcasts or voice search or metaverse back when it mattered. Or other techniques or other channels, I should say. In our case, one of the things that I would do at Estee Lauder Companies is publish a list of these are the validated channels in terms of ones we should really support, probably hold steady, and then disinvest from. And every year something new would come up, like TikTok Shop, which came in last year, and I would say, we're going to hold on that in terms of what's our conclusion on whether it works. So inevitably, new channels are always here. So my question is, do traditional approaches apply? Or how do you think about a new channel in terms of measuring it as it comes in? So we'll start with Joseph. then Anna, and then Ross.
So I think new channels and the proliferation of media options, even within existing channels, just how formats and things that are available change. The old measurement techniques are adaptable, right? But it goes back to kind of understanding the data and where it comes from, how it's made, and what are the biases. So you mentioned podcast. Right? Podcast is an interesting one because you don't really have good visibility into when it was consumed, depending on the platform, and there's a lot of different distribution platforms where people can consume that media. So understanding what you're getting, what you're not getting, kind of getting to that 80-20 rule of it's never going to be perfect, but this is good enough for the measurement purpose that I have. Adapting the existing techniques around those biases, but also understanding what other measurement is enabled because of these new platforms, whether they be in-platform capabilities, so some native geo-testing or RCT, or something that's enabled via a partner like a TU where we've got identity integrations. A lot of these platforms can be true RCT holdout tests. I think there's a lot that can be learned. It's not what I would heard in the industry, like data deprecation. Oh my God, it's just the proliferation of data. There's so much data out there. You have to really be able to understand what it is, what's meaningful, and how do you slot it into your existing measurement. Don't throw it all out, oh, it's unmeasurable. There are ways to measure everything, such as the point that we've been talking about earlier. There's no mother of all models, there's no magic bullet, and some techniques are more appropriate for certain types of data, but you have to understand the biases, where it comes from, how it's made, and how does it fit into the thing you're trying to measure. Because again, not all media is designed to drive the same tactic or the same outcome, and not all media is going to have the same immediacy of impact. So on the timing bias, right? Are you expecting it to convert very quickly? What is a conversion? Defining all of those things is super important when you start talking about evaluating new channels and giving things time, giving you time to learn how they work in the real world.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more. I think it all starts to at having a KPI framework that ladders up to what are your business goals and objectives, how is marketing supporting and driving those goals, and then how do your in-channel metrics support them and drive marketing and business goals. So there should be a consistent framework that is used across your businesses, across the regions and globes if you have a global business, that all connects and ladders up. So while there may be new measurement techniques and KPIs that you want to track, it should have an objective that you're driving towards. So for example, if your business goal is to grow market share, then your marketing goal as a part of that is to gain relevant reach. At each stage of the customer journey, from awareness through conversion, you should track specific KPIs by each channel. So within a CTV channel like we've been talking about, your awareness metrics might be a CPM, where your conversion metrics might be a cost per acquisition in a social channel. So the metrics don't necessarily need to change, they just need to drive towards an outcome that ties to your business objectives.
I would say with the new channel, like hypothetically you're launching connected TV for the first time, you can measure in-platform, so how many impressions did you get versus other in-platform metrics. I really like the approach of trial and error and exploration too. So relating it to other things. You're launching this program, you got a lot of impressions, did you see more traffic to the site? Did you see more searches for your brand on Google? You can kind of start basic. I think sometimes people get sort of paralyzed by like not reaching the mountaintop in one step. And what's the sort of basic way to try to extract the signal from the noise and say, hey, we did this, like is anything up or not?
For the next topic, I want to get into measuring brand versus performance marketing. I think I've been at some conferences where people say it's the same thing, it's all together. I would say at some companies it's still a debate. At Estee Lauder companies, it was very much still a debate because different budget owners basically controlled different parts of the funnel. So what we did is we came up with a multi-stage approach to have a model looking at Google search as the upper funnel metric. So not necessarily detecting awareness, but desirability. So upper funnel was Google search. Middle funnel was site traffic. Did people come to the site and just go there and not make a sale yet? And then bottom of the funnel, did consumers actually make a purchase? And by decomposing it into three parts, then I could go back to the brand teams to tell them how much of the spend was going to each part of the funnel. And that was a way to help demystify that debate. But I would still argue that debate exists, so let's get into it here. Is that debate in your brands and the clients that you guys work with? How do you think about that debate? Do I still have it right? Do we still debate this? And how would you go about measuring it in the same ecosystem? So Anna, we'll start with you.
So I'm going to take a maybe slightly different approach on just the measurement, but why I've seen in a lot of clients that they first don't have the operating model set up correctly, where a brand marketing team might sit separately than your performance marketing teams. So they have different goals, objectives, and they need to be connected and talking and making sure that there's a single, they have a single way of working and a single outcome that they're driving towards. So definitely it's important to have, where you have separate brand and performance teams, that they connect and work together.
Here, how's that? So the debate definitely exists, but I think it's an organizational debate. I think everybody who's a measurement professional or a marketer sort of knows that brand is performance and performance drives brand, right? Proving that out is more of an organizational adoption challenge than an analytical challenge, because the empirical evidence is there that says both are driving both. Now, to different extents, different categories, all of that is true. Multi-stage regression, that's something that we've been doing for a long time, sort of through the funnel analysis. One of the more interesting pieces of work that we've done to kind of try to settle the debate, which it will never be settled as long as org structures are not designed by marketers, but they're designed by other folks. Maybe something for our friends in the management consultancies to add to their repertoire of how to design an effective organization to build brands. But we've done some work with Ally Financial, MMA Global, and Donata. So using user-level analysis, a time series panel, so not a MMM, but using more of a multi-touch attribution and RCT approach, we were able to deterministically show that exposure to brand media, so Ally's a digital bank very focused on performance, DR, that exposure to brand media, which was a big change to how they were executing both creative and the channels that they were using, not only changed perceptions, so it changed people from either having no opinion or an unfavorable opinion about the brand to having a favorable opinion. And I know it sounds like I'm giving you a lot of detail. Andrea, who's the CMO over there, has presented all of these with excruciating detail at multiple industry events, so I'm not breaching any confidentiality. You can go check it out at the Possible Conference videos online. She's also done it at ANA, ARF, other places. But we proved out that you're able to change those perceptions and then following people through that journey, right? So they go from having either no to low favorability about the brand to being favorables. 8, 9, 10 months later, when they become a customer, the acquisition cost is much cheaper. So proving out deterministically that brand is an annuity that pays out over time changed the way they go to market. It changed the way they think about media and marketing in general. But it's going to be a long, long, slow burn because, to your point, big organizations are mature. Their organizational structures are set up in these silos. And there is kind of this my KPI, your KPI. And I don't care if my thing is driving your KPI because I don't get bonused against that. It's a definite problem. It's not something that you can't overcome if you have the right measurement in place, and whether that's with an external partner or an internal team of experts to help evangelize and tell the story in a way that different stakeholder groups can understand how these things work together, not against each other, how they're not separate things, and how brand really is important at driving performance. I won't get into all of that theory, but there's a lot of research that supports strong brands perform better overall, are more resilient long-term, more resilient to all of the different headwinds that folks experience.
I remember the quote, I know half of my marketing is working, I just don't know which half. And I feel like upper funnel is sort of that half. It's a really hard thing, and I think if you're working with your finance team or I've been in private equity environments, there's a lot of scrutiny around how do you justify it, and I think there's a little bit of an art in the science. I think something that I mentioned earlier is like volume of brand search, I think is a clear and easy indicator of health of a brand. And I think if you chase that lower funnel, you sort of circle the bathtub drain versus really building that awareness. And Doug, I love what you have done and talked about in terms of taking those brand searches and incorporating it into the model, and like upper funnel media is correlated to to brand search. I think that's a really key learning.
Customer lifetime value is one of the metrics I talked about at the beginning that roughly 59% of marketers use, but it requires a long-term set of data, longitudinal data to calculate. And at Estee Lauder companies, while we have first-party CDPs, we found it very complex to calculate, and it became an ad hoc idea. So if we talk about that, is that an issue that you see across other, I guess, metrics that you look at? I mean, a lot of what we talked about today are either models or their approaches. CLTV is a metric. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think it's one of the most important things to look at because it does take in the long-term value of the customer. But what I'm saying is it's ad hoc and it can be difficult. So how do you think about CLTV? And how do you think it belongs, if you will, in these different measurement approaches? So Ross, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I've been in, the fortunate, maybe for this calculation, circumstance of not having stores. So we had wholesale distribution, but it's really owned like direct-to-consumer e-com data. And, I think we didn't really overthink the retailer part and the wholesale part. It was really just for our own ecosystem of e-com data, really putting everything in one environment, looking at customers over, say, the last 5 years. I like to do, sort of a simple visual of like year 1, year 2, year 3, down to year 5, year 10, whatever you want to do, and then across, you say like what year they started, and you see this sort of like graph that shows the trend, and like for first year, is it the same every year? Is it going up? Is it going down? And I think if like Doug's a new customer for 2020, how much did he spend? Anna's a new customer for 2021, how much did she spend? And then looking at that over year 1, that's their year 1, their year 2, their year 3. And then agreeing internally of like, we're going to calculate maybe a 3-year lifetime value, and we're going to do some kind of net present value on like revenue today is worth more than revenue next year. So maybe you discount future revenue by 10% or something like that. I actually had the conversation with my CEO, and he's like, I don't understand that. Just make it 100%. I was like, okay. But I think you can start simply. I think another way to sort of pull that apart is like different categories. I think it could be a lot harder if you have a lot of store data. The data is not together, or most of your distribution is through wholesale. But I think really starting with like what's straightforward, what you can measure, and what you can measure from an acquisition perspective, and really right sizing like your payoff for the customer, what your margin is, what your financial targets are, and then how much you're paying. Like we talked a lot about the CAC to LTV ratio, customer acquisition cost versus the lifetime value, and you want that ratio to be a certain amount, to kind of maintain and grow profitability.
So it's definitely an important metric. Not all industries here, unfortunately, are created equal with access to information. So if you're a bank, you've got all sorts of visibility into what's going on with your customers. If you're a CPG or FMCG, you're going to have a little bit more challenge because you're not owning that distribution most of the time, right? So it's important. It doesn't have to be the most scientifically accurate down to the 15th decimal to get to, because really what this is, the crux of it is, it's value versus volume, right? Do you want to drive tonnage or do you want to drive value to the brand? And it's a matter of, how do you drive an acceptable amount of volume that brings back the maximum value to that brand? So there's a lot of ways that you can proxy for it, but you also have to be cognizant, and you're in this boat right, at Estee. You've got a lot of brands that you have to support. You can't just rush everything into your most valuable brands or the ones that have that highest LTV or enterprise payback. So it's a balance. I think it's an important strategic question. Analytics can certainly feed into it, but really at the end of it, it's a proxy for value versus volume. And I think that's what we as marketers, we as analytics professionals have to strike that balance between sort of quarterly rush to the report to the street versus driving that longer term franchise value. Comes back to metrics, comes back to organization. We work with a lot of companies. We work with one FS company in particular, lots of diverse business units. Every single one of them has a different idea of what LTV means, right? Some are on a 5-year, some are on a 10-year, some are on a 90-day. And even harmonizing that across an enterprise, it's a massive undertaking because you're changing people's religion almost. So as long as you're as a marketer or a stakeholder in one of these industries, as long as you're cognizant of that value trade-off, I think you're in the right space. No one's ever going to get CLTV perfect, but at least you have to recognize that it exists.
Yeah, I think Joe said it best. It's a balance. You have to balance it with what your cost per acquisition, what your customer lifetime value is, and it's definitely easier for certain industries. Industries that have membership data, that have loyalty programs, it's easier to calculate then.
Wonderful. I think we might have time for Q&A. I'm looking for my brand innovators friends. Yes, they're saying yes. So we have time for Q&A. And we'll have to steal one of our microphones up here to go, or just shout. Yes, in the back.
This question's for Joe. Who are your primary customers? I know you work with brands, you shared that. Do you work with publishers, do you work with agencies, media owners? Like, who do you provide your measurement data for?
So all of the above. And this will sound kind of like a cop-out consultancy answer. Many of our relationships are brand direct, right? So we will typically provide measurement for the world's leading advertisers. And I don't know who I'm allowed to say sort of on the mic, but offline I can tell you some. But they're brands that you've all heard of and probably some that you haven't. We do work with agencies. We have extensive agency partners at the holdco level with everybody. We also do work with publishers directly as data suppliers, integration partners, and providing meta-analyses back to them to help them understand how does their media benchmark against everybody else who's in the mix. Because publishers are all competing for the same share of wallet. So it's kind of across the board. The techniques are all relatively similar, but they are tailored to the specific use case in terms of what data we bring to the table, how we tell that story, how we package and merchandise it. But we work with everybody. We also act on behalf of other providers, sort of the intel inside, right? Where we're either providing our data, our analytics, or our consulting firepower, but under a white label type of arrangement. So we'll meet our clients where they need us to be. We don't buy or sell media, so we are fortunate that we can operate and be friends with everybody.
I would add that there's only like 6, 7, 8 marketing mix modeling companies out there at all. Forrester Research does a wave report that I think is discoverable if you Google it. So beyond TransUnion, there's a couple of companies that do that.
Gartner's coming out with the Magic Quadrant soonish.
Very good. Okay, let's celebrate our panelists. Congratulations.